This is the Spycraft 101 podcast. Welcome to your clandestine classroom. This is episode number 193 of the Spycraft 101 podcast. I'm joined today by Emanuele Midolo. Emanuele is a journalist based in London and writing for The Times and The Sunday Times. His work has appeared in Forbes, Wired UK, and publications across the United Kingdom, France, and Italy. I invited Emanuele onto the podcast to discuss his new book, which he co-authored with Peter Gillman, titled Murder in Cairo, Solving a Cold War Spy Mystery. It was just published last month and is the story of the previously unsolved murder of British journalist David Holden, who was killed just hours after arriving in Cairo to pursue a story in December 1977. Emanuele and Peter pursued this story relentlessly and found not only several different possible motives and murderers, but also that David had been keeping many secrets of his own. By the way, if you're looking for a way to get friends and family as interested in history as you are, or if you want to learn something new and unexpected every month, then make sure to check out History by Mail. Every month, History by Mail will send you reproductions of famous and influential historical documents from American history. Accompanying the documents themselves are articles which put them in the context of their times and help you understand the impact they had on the course of American life. The topics are widely varied, so you're always learning something new across themes that include historic inventions, American wars, and foreign diplomatic relations. I'm really enjoying my own subscription because it's opened my eyes to historic events I knew nothing about. You can subscribe for yourself or gift a subscription at historybymail.com for as little as $6.50 a month. Just click the link in the show notes of this episode and use the discount code JUSTIN10 for a permanent 10% off your subscription. Emanuele, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Of course. I have to tell you, now that I've actually read the book, I am shocked that I had not heard much about this story before, because it really just does have it all. And I can see why people, including yourself, pursued the truth for so many years after this took place.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those cases that's probably stranger than fiction.
Yeah, I totally agree. So many twists and turns, which I'm excited to talk about with you today. So, as I mentioned in the introduction, you co-authored this with Peter Gillman, and that's pretty rare here on the podcast that we talk to a co-written book like that. So, how did that come about exactly, that relationship?
So basically, Peter is an investigative journalist who's a bit older than me, is in his 80s now. And many years ago, he trained me in investigative journalism when I first came to London to become an investigative journalist. And during some of his courses, he would say stuff like, I told you about my successes, and now let me tell you about the one time that we failed. And proceeded to tell the story of the assassination of one of his colleagues, this guy named David Holden, who was the Sunday Times chief foreign correspondent, who was killed in Cairo in 1977. Now, Peter spent a year trying to find out who killed his colleague and why, but he couldn't get to the bottom of it. And this basically obsessed him for a long time. It was the one case that he couldn't crack, he couldn't solve. And I was already intrigued when he talked to me about this, but the real moment when I was getting into this whole story was when a few years later, in 2020, I joined the Times and Sunday Times at that point, the newspapers for which Peter used to work in the 1970s and 1980s. And the editor of the Sunday Times back then was a guy named Harry Evans. Yeah, Tina Brown's husband. I'm sure your listeners are familiar with Tina Brown. He was considered, the best newspaper editor in Britain because he sort of revolutionized investigative journalism and investigative journalism in the country. So when Harry died in 2020, he was in his 90s, I emailed Peter, expressed my condolences, and he said that the last two times I had seen Harry told him that he was still troubled by the Holden case and he wanted to get to see it through. So that was the moment where I was like, wow, this guy had this amazing career, but up to his very last days was still obsessed about this one case. So I started doing a bit of digging, shared my findings with Peter, and then, almost 5 years later, here we are. We got the book out finally.
Yeah, it's amazing, and congratulations to you guys because I can see the amount of effort that went into this. And I have to tell you, the way that you two framed this story within the book was completely new to me, and it was really really interesting the way that you kind of paralleled investigations across the decades. Because just for the listeners to understand, a big portion of the book really is Peter going through the original investigation with his colleagues, and then years and years later, decades later, you, Emanuele, are in some ways following in his footsteps, and in other ways, you're kind of making a new trail and making a lot of headway in the story. And I have not seen that in any of the other nonfiction that I've read over the past few years. So I loved it. Honestly, it was a fantastic way to tell this story.
Thank you. Yeah, we thought the sort of quest to find out was part of the story. The story was not just a sort of biography of this chap, David Holden, who was killed in mysterious circumstances in Cairo in 1977, but it was a story. It was the story of Peter as well, and of his colleagues. Peter was not alone in this when he started investigating the case. Harry Evans sent a team of 6 journalists to the Middle East to try and find out what happened. But Peter was one of 2 people who stayed on the case for a year. Harry Evans told him, just do this, do nothing else, no expense spared. Those were the days. You never hear these kind of these kind of words coming out of an editor's mouth these days. And he did. He spent a year on the case, and then he wrote this 110-page report that was aimed at, it was supposed to be for the editor's eyes only, because it was speculative. He had an incredible amount of information about the death of David Holden and also his life, but it was inconclusive. He couldn't publish it. By the way, they couldn't publish it anyway, even if they wanted to, because at that point the newspaper was closed for a year. Something people probably don't realize nowadays. I mean, I had no idea about this stuff when I started researching this, but the newspaper was engaged in this titanic battle with the print unions, with this incredible power, and they just decided that the newspaper was not going to get distributed. And so the owners of the Sunday Times and the Times decided to just not have a newspaper for a year. I mean, it's different era. So anyway, so nothing was published, and Peter kept sort of investigating in his spare time. He never really stayed away from the case. He was always looking for hints and clues and new leads, but when I talked to him in 2020, he was sort of semi-retired. He thought, as I said, this was the case that got away, essentially.
Yeah, I can see how that would stay with him, and as it stayed with the editor as well over so many years. And thank goodness, like fresh blood, like you, so to speak, stepped up and had the energy and the time and the motivation to look into it. Can you tell me what it was like for you to actually go to Egypt and try to look into this story yourself? I understand that was a little bit harrowing.
Yeah, I mean, trip to Egypt was an interesting experience. I've done some kind of foreign reporting. I'm not a foreign reporter. I tend to work in an office. I tend to do, investigative journalism these days is quite different to what it used to be. I love to get out of the office more. But Peter was a foreign correspondent as well as David Holden. And he kind of knew some of these grounds better because he'd been to Jordan, for example, many times that year, working on different stories. So it was kind of, it was more used to all of this, but still he was completely baffled by, some of the aspects of this case. And what I found is that despite, I was coming in 45 years later, people did not want to talk about that at all. I was getting some really strong pushbacks from official sources, and a lot of people actually just decided not to meet me, not to speak with me. For example, some of the families of the people that, we think were involved in this case just shut me down completely. And I had a couple of interesting encounters as well, which if you read the book, you know what I'm talking about. I was under surveillance for most of the time. I mean, Egypt is obviously a police state, so I did not expect anything less than that. I was kind of surprised though, because I thought, this was so long ago that, that it was a cold case. So I was like, well, maybe they don't really care about this stuff, even 45 years later. But then again, the kind of intelligence community, there's a direct link to that era. We're talking about 1977, to give you a bit of context, is when the president of Egypt was this guy called Anwar Sadat. And, they're sort of 3 steps removed from the president of Egypt now, but Sadat was a man of the military like Sisi, the current president of Egypt, and his successor Mubarak reigned until, for 40 years or whatever. So there's again, like there's a kind of direct link to that era, which I probably didn't appreciate when I went to Cairo.
Okay. Yeah. I can see how that would be shocking because just like you said, it's been 45 years. Like who could still care that much about those secrets? I mean, quite frankly, a lot has happened in Egypt since 1977 that would seem to be a little bit more pressing, more of a priority, but apparently not.
Yeah.
Apparently not. I'm almost surprised. So what about Peter and his colleagues? Did they ever feel like they were in danger at the time when they were looking into this, like right after it happened? Any threats or close calls or anything like that?
Well, yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think the main thing here is that obviously this was a strange case to begin with. So they were investigating the death. They were investigating the murder of one of their colleagues, and that, for starters, is not something that luckily happens very often. But the most concerning aspect is that during the second trip that they did, Peter did multiple trips to the Middle East. During the second trip, when he went to Egypt, at some point they realized that someone was stealing these messages that he and his colleagues were sending back to the Sunday Times office in London. Someone had been stealing these messages, and they realized that they were actually stealing the messages that Holden himself had been sending to the office, because Holden at that point had been in this sort of 10-day swing across the Middle East, traveling across several countries. And so that got them very concerned, because they, did the killers get the information about Holden from the horse's mouth, essentially? Did they get it from us? That was the first question that they asked themselves. And then the second one was, are we walking into the same trap as Holden? Are they following us because they want to kill us as well? So it was peak paranoia time. And that the theft of these messages, which at that point were called telexes. So it was like in between a telegram and a fax, essentially. The theft of these telexes was one of the most troubling aspects of the entire investigation. And it remained a mystery until very recently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that was shocking for me just to read it in the pages of the book. Like, my gosh, this thing goes worldwide. Essentially, this is not like a local problem being hushed up by the local police state, as you mentioned. This is something that reaches all the way back into the offices of the newspaper investigator. Just incredible stuff, honestly.
Mm-hmm.
So we've mentioned David, but we haven't actually talked about David, really. Can you tell me who he was and what it was that actually brought him to Cairo at that time?
Well, that's $1 million question. Who was this guy? I mean, who was David Holden?
Yeah, I'm still not sure I know, honestly. But not
Me neither. I could tell you 5 years. Well, Peter's been doing for almost 50 years, 48 years, and still we don't really know exactly what this guy was. They thought they knew him. They thought they knew him as the sort of respected, well-liked figure of a foreign correspondent. He was like the quintessential foreign correspondent. If you looked at the pictures of him, he had this kind of, debonair attitude and sort of, someone described as a mix between Roger Moore and like another Hollywood actor. And indeed, he wanted to become an actor as a young man, which is probably one of the reasons why he did some of the things that he did. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. But Holden was the chief foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times. He'd written books. He'd been working for the biggest newspapers in England, the Times, the Guardian, the Sunday Times. And he was very much at the peak of his career. He was 53, china blue eyes, slicked back hair, always impeccably dressed. But there was, there was an aura of mystery around him that, the more the reporters looked into his life, the more they found about him, the sorts of multiple lives that he was living. Holden had been sent to the Middle East to report on these crucial peace conferences between Egypt and Israel. This was after Israel and Egypt fought into a war in 1973, the Yom Kippur or the Ramadan War. And just a few weeks before, the president of Egypt, Anwar Sadat, paid a historic visit to Jerusalem. It was unprecedented. It was the first time that an Arab state leader went to Jerusalem. He talked at the Knesset, at the Israel parliament. And it served essentially as the recognition, unofficial recognition of Israel's right to exist, which no other Arab states had done ever since the founding of Israel in the 1940s. It was a momentous shift in global politics, and especially in the Middle East. And the Israelis were due to reciprocate at a peace conference in Cairo in December. And this is the reason why Holden was traveling across the region. He'd been to Syria, to Damascus, he'd been to Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and then ultimately Cairo, which was going to be, the final destination and the kind of the most important step of his journey. But as soon as he landed in Cairo, he disappeared. He didn't check in with the Sunday Times foreign desk, and a massive search was launched. And then eventually, 3 days later, they heard that the body of an unknown Western man had been taken to the local mortuary, to the morgue, and he was identified as Holton. He'd been shot with a single bullet from the back to the heart, and the mechanics of the killing was very elaborate. It was a professional hit by all appearances.
Mm-hmm. So that's really shocking. It sounds like he basically walked out of the airport and was never seen alive again, which is, not only very frightening, but it indicates that they were ready and waiting for him, whoever it was that took him. So was there an immediate suspicion that it was a professional thing, or was it concerned that it was like, his taxi was robbed or something like that on the way to the hotel?
Well, just the way the guy who went to the morgue and identified it was a fellow journalist working for the BBC, a guy called Bob Jobbins. He said to us, the guy is still alive. He still remembers, the sort of shivers down his spine when he actually saw the body. He said, my experience was that you don't get shot in the back for no reason. And, even in Cairo in the 70s, the murder of foreigners was actually very rare. And the fact that he was, by all looks of it, he'd been shot once at short range with a sort of small caliber, 9mm. It kind of bore all the marks for a professional hit. But then what they found afterwards confirmed that, as you were saying, that, his killers were out to get him, essentially. They'd stolen 3 cars, and the timing of these thefts of these cars was particularly interesting because they coincided with Holden's movements. The first car had been stolen 24 hours after he decided that he was going to go to the Middle East, that he confirmed with his editors that he was going. And then the last car was stolen a day before he actually flew to Cairo from Amman. So they knew exactly when he was going to be at the airport, and they were ready to get him. They were waiting for him.
Yeah, very, very professional, no question about it. Were the Cairo police, were they genuinely helpful and interested in catching the culprits? Do you think, in the early days at least, or were they trying to do any sort of cover up or something like that?
You see, this is interesting. Peter is convinced that at the beginning they were very helpful and cooperative, and then at some point something changed. He reckons now, with the benefit of hindsight, that they've probably been told to stop cooperating with the Brits. But to me, the telling detail has always been that they did not allow 2 investigators from Scotland Yard to visit Egypt from day one. They said that they would, and then, they never did. So the Sunday Times journalists were actually the only British investigators on the ground. And they did a lot of, they did cover a lot of ground in terms of the investigation itself. They found out much more than the Egyptian police in terms of what Holden was up to. Also because, as I said before, Harry Evans sent 6 people to the Middle East, so across 3 or 4 countries. So they could effectively reconstruct his last trip.
So they knew where he went and all that. Did they ever identify, whether the journalists or the Cairo police ever identify any actual suspects?
Now, there were a few people that met Holden during the last days, and some of the details of the kind of version of events didn't really add up. And the journalists at first were asking themselves, are these people just misremembering? But then sorts of gaps and inconsistencies emerged, and it all became a bit more sinister than they initially thought. The Egyptians didn't really indict anyone. They arrested some Palestinians and said that they thought that these guys were actually behind the killing, but then they released them, and it was clear that it was just something to give something to the press in terms of, we're doing our job. We're actually investigating this thoroughly. Sadat himself was mentioning this in his speeches and meetings, but, nothing came of it. And eventually what they did was starting spreading this information about the motives for the killing. So they started saying, it was a robbery gone wrong, or this guy might have been gay and he was actually hitting on a taxi driver. And so, taxi driver decided to shoot him in the back, as you do. That homophobic, I guess. No, I mean, this, as I said, first they were kind of helpful and cooperative in a way, and then they started shutting down the Sunday Times reporters, and eventually they ruled that the killing was a robbery gone wrong, which clearly wasn't. I mean, as I said, just the mechanics of it was so elaborate. The killers had picked him up in one car, which had been resprayed. He'd been transferred to a second car in which he was shot. And then the killers had done their getaway in the third car. And that's not a robbery.
Right,
if you're getting to that length.
So if I recall correctly, I think that due to like the bullet placement, they thought that he had been like in the front passenger seat and someone in the back seat reached over the seat and shot him in the back. Is that correct? Like it went on a downward arc?
Correct.
Yeah.
They had removed the sort of header from the front seat so that they could actually shoot him from the back. So it was kind of that's what that's the detail that told the Sunday Times journalists that they just basically wanted him dead. They already arranged that to happen.
Okay. I know that obviously their investigation was kind of inconclusive, but did Peter and his colleagues initially have like a most likely scenario or like a working theory of who had done it, or were they just totally stumped?
The first week was completely inconclusive. They published a long story, which turned out to be the only story that the Sunday Times published for 48 years until last month, until we did, the Silver book. Again, describing the mechanics and the cars and all the rest of the stuff. That's when, and after the theft of the telexes, that these messages that the team was sending to the Sunday Times, that's when Harry Evans, the editor, instructed Peter and another one of his colleagues to sort of enlarge the scope of the investigation, to try and find out as much as they could about Holden's life and not just his death. Because the first assumption was that he must have, during his sort of journalistic activity, he must have done something that had led him to his death. But then because of this sort of, elaborate killing, professional hit, they started wondering, this sounds like something else. It's not a journalist, foreign correspondent blown up by landmine or, killed while reporting war. This guy was there to report peace, and he was the first. It's unheard of for someone to be assassinated that way. So what they did was they went back and talked to pretty much everyone who had known Holden, and that's interesting because a lot of people actually didn't really know him. It was this sort of mysterious, opaque character who was never really getting close to anyone. Even the people that were described as his best friends claimed that they didn't really know him that well. And so this sort of secrecy became the details of the multiple lives that he was leading, because some of the things that they found was about his personal life, not just his professional one. Do you want me to talk about this?
Yeah, please,
now?
If you do, at least a little bit. There's a lot, of course. I'll leave that to the readers for the most part. But I mean, some things were shocking, and they were really questioning if they'd ever known the guy at all, I guess, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the biggest kind of reveal was that despite the fact that Holden was married to a woman, of a journalist called Ruth Holden, he'd actually been secretly gay or bisexual. And he had this very long affair with an older man, an academic called Leo Silberman. And, obviously this being 1977, this was kind of a shock to them, because the marriage seemed to be a marriage of convenience. Many years later, I found out that Ruth was probably gay as well.
Oh, wow.
And the relationship with this man was interesting, because they seemed to be following each other around the world. This guy was a very mysterious figure. He was sort of a con man, kind of a bit of an imposter who was, bragging about stuff he'd done and connections he had, which he didn't really have. And he claimed that he had a PhD at Oxford, which he didn't. He was using the sort of Oxford College masthead for years and years, even if that he had dropped out from the college. So it was an interesting character. And Peter started to think that this guy was sort of probably the most important relationship in Holden's life. But obviously it was so secret. I mean, the whole thing, because back when they had this affair, homosexuality was illegal in England. They were being incredibly careful not to disclose any information about their affair.
Mm-hmm. It seemed like, reading through the book, it seemed like David kind of structured his life and certainly his travels all around spending time with Leo, like all over the world, right? Like Leo goes off to a new job in a new area and David finds a way to make it there somehow, some way, right?
Absolutely. And it wasn't, nice places like, I don't know, the Amalfi Coast or California or whatever it is. This guy was going to Sudan.
Yeah.
In the 1950s, which, I mean, not exactly like a tourist destination. But David was so desperate to actually go and join him. At this point, he was working for the Times, so the daily newspaper, the Times of London. And he was the Cairo correspondent at that point, talking about the 1950s. He was pestering his editors to be sent to Sudan. The editors would baffled. It was like, why would you go to, why do you want to go to Sudan? And he was making excuses. He was saying, there's going to be like a regional election and stuff like that. And then after 3 or 4 times asking them, he said, if you don't send me, I'm going to go on my own. I'm going to take annual leave and actually go to Sudan on my own. And now obviously what Peter found out was that the reason he was so desperate to go to Sudan was because Silberman was there.
Mm-hmm.
He'd been to Mexico together. Which is an interesting place. I mean, you guys done stuff about these JFK files that were released in the last few weeks.
Mexico City keeps popping up, right?
Yeah, it's an interesting place. And David lied about what he was doing. He'd been telling people that he spent some time working for a charity, like a Quaker organization, building schools or whatever. And then when Peter checked, the Quaker organization said, actually, yeah, he was here, but he was only here for 2 weeks or whatever. And then, we didn't know what he did after that. So it's been spending months in Mexico with this guy. And Peter had no idea what they were up to. So he talked to someone and someone said, well, Mexico is an interesting place for people close to the Soviet Union, the KGB. It was a training ground. And so that sort of idea of the fact that Holden might have been, how should I put it? Peter had no idea whether Holden was kind of close to the Soviet Union, because by all appearances, Holden was a sort of conservative, anti-communist person who was writing this kind of vitriolic attacks on people like Castro, Cuba, or Salvador Allende of Chile. He'd been writing for this magazine called Encounter magazine, which I think your listeners would be familiar with, which was bankrolled by the CIA.
Mm-hmm.
And he was writing this sort of disinformation, this kind of American propaganda essentially against these leaders. So the fact that Silberman seemed to be quite left-wing and that they'd been traveling across places that were interesting to the Soviets was kind of baffling because, by all appearances, Holden was completely the opposite. He was, if anything, they thought they'd been recruited or that there'd been at least an attempt to recruit him while he was at Cambridge to join MI6, the British intelligence services. And then he went on to write for this magazine that was bankrolled by the CIA. The CIA actually admitted to the Sunday Times that Holden was a sort of like a low-level informant to the CIA. And so this secret life with Silberman didn't really fit with the rest of the information that they had.
Yes, just mysteries within mysteries there. And I mean, really left me, twisted around, no question about it. Probably you as well during the whole investigation, I'm sure. And if I remember correctly, since you mentioned MI6, I probably have the details wrong, but didn't he go overseas for a year? Like he put his studies on hold for a year as a young man, and it his travels kind of fit the profile of like a MI6 like initial training or something like that. Do I recall that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there was this strange moment while he was a student at Cambridge, and Cambridge is a notorious recruiting ground,
sure.
or at least was, for MI6, and not just MI6 as we know now. He arranged to go to Czechoslovakia for a year to teach English, which was a standard thing that, when MI6 was recruiting people at these colleges, then they would send them out to countries in Eastern Europe or what have you, and then debrief them about what was going on. Then they would spend another year or two teaching in England, or in this case in Scotland, to sort of fit with this profile of them being teachers. And then they would either join the Foreign Office or, in Holden's case, became a journalist. That's what was really funny, was that's literally like a subplot of John le Carre's novel Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. It wasn't Czechoslovakia, I think it was Bulgaria, but it was pretty much the same kind of structure. And Peter was reading the book back in 1977 as he was writing the Holden report, and the similarities were just striking. Of course, now we know that John le Carre, David Cornwall had been working for MI6, and the book had been based on the Kim Philby scandal, effectively. So it's a sort of fictionalized version of what happened with the Cambridge spy Kim Philby 10 years earlier. So yeah, I mean, we couldn't really get to the bottom of his relationship with MI6. If anything, the British intelligence services are even more secretive than the Americans when it comes to this stuff. Yeah. They will never confirm or deny that someone is an agent. And to be fair, we didn't even try to get anything out of them, because it was just, but Ben McIntyre was this guy who's been writing this very successful spy non-fiction books, including a great book about Philby, just told me that, there's really no point. Like, people think I've got access with them, but I really don't. What I do is try to interview former spies so that, they can tell me about what they've done. But MI6 just doesn't deal with authors, and, well, for that matter, not even with journalists.
Yeah, the bane of every intelligence historian, that's for sure. It's constant roadblocks. It's come up many times here on the podcast, I can assure you. Absolutely. Unfortunately. Yeah, at least the CIA, at least they have like a declassification schedule, and they kind of stick to it, to a certain extent.
Yeah, it's interesting you mentioned this, because obviously in this case, they didn't. And back in the late 70s, early 80s, the Sunday Times filed a FOIA, Freedom of Information request with the CIA. And the CIA initially said that they didn't have any files on Holden, which the Sunday Times just said that we just don't believe you. I mean, it's just impossible that, this guy was a foreign correspondent in Washington for a few years in the 1950s. So there's simply no way that you don't have at least, a few files about him. And they said, oh yeah, actually we do have some files, but some of this stuff is redacted. So some of this stuff is sensitive, so you're not going to see it. So the Sunday Times decided to sue the CIA, which I think at that point was unprecedented. They took them to court to release these files. And a judge was eventually appointed to look at the files in camera, so, in private. And this judge was supposed to be like a liberal judge. He'd ruled in favor of the press before. And he went in, looked at the files, came out and said that nothing would be released because it would endanger the security of the United States of America.
My gosh.
So there was something in those files. Mm-hmm. But, fast forward 45 years later, I tried to get those files myself. And again, I thought, maybe after almost 50 years, they're just going to release them. Maybe, all the people mentioned are dead or mm-hmm. whatever. They can finally at least give us something. And that's when I got a spooky phone call from someone who introduced themselves with then first name only, saying, I'm so-and-so from the agency. And I do get a lot of phone calls, so I was a bit baffled by that. So I did ask, sorry, which agency? The Central Intelligence Agency. All right, okay, yeah, it's not the kind of call I would expect on a Tuesday afternoon.
Right.
Anyway, this person wants to chat off the record and then said, I would really want to steer you off the idea that the CIA had anything to do with David Holden. And I was flabbergasted because that's a question I didn't ask. I just asked for the files. It's like a very I don't know why you're telling me this because I literally just asked for these files. This person replied saying, there's nothing in our holdings about David Holden. There's nothing in our files. And I just said that I'm sorry, but that's simply impossible because of the history of this case. I told this person what the history was and how the Sunday Times had actually sued the CIA for these files. And this person said, I'm sorry, I want to steer you off and I can't offer you no guidance on this matter, and then hung up. and the only reason I'm talking about this is because obviously, the call was supposed to be off the record, but it was just a lie. I mean, it was just, there was no, there's no way that they don't have anything in their files. It's just impossible. And, even if the files have been destroyed or whatever, anyway, after the story broke, serialized it in the Sunday Times, the CIA actually went on the record, which I thought was quite funny, saying that they categorically deny having anything to do with David Holden's murder. And even knowing anything about it, it's just kind of counterintuitive.
That phone call, it was so comical to read that, whoever that person was, they could not have done a worse job of steering you away from CIA interest and involvement.
Yeah, I was really baffled by that because if that was the thing, if that was the idea, I mean, surely you get a phone call from someone from the CIA that tells you, you do not look into this. You very much want to look into that, yeah. Right? Or, trust me. I'm this anonymous person introduces themselves, their first name only, and mm-hmm. I'm going to tell you, we have nothing to do with David Holden's murder. It's like, all right, okay, well, thank you very much. That's a big relief.
Yeah, I have no further questions. Thank you. Yeah.
No further question, Your Honor. Anyway.
Gosh. Okay, yeah, that was so bizarre, such a, just unexpected twist there, as there were many in this story. So obviously, Peter's team and then you as well, years later, you uncovered a lot of interesting things about David's life, but did any of that kind of help hone the suspect list? I mean, do you felt like you were closer to why he was murdered or who might have done it?
So back in 1978, after a year on the case, Peter had come up with a list of theories of, who might have killed Holden and why. The list was fairly long at that point. It had the Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, because of a number of reasons, mainly because the Sunday Times had published a very damaging expose of Israeli torture of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails 6 months before. And Holden had been wrongly named as the author of that report. Then they actually issued a statement saying Holden had nothing to do with this report. It was actually Peter Gillman who wrote it. Oh. And Peter was like, oh, thank you very much. Thanks, guys. And this is why, actually, it's just a funny anecdote. When Peter was sent by Harry Evans to the Middle East, back then there was no kind of security debrief and, the kind of stuff that I had to do when I went to Egypt. My newspaper was very good and very thorough. They gave me a burner phone. They gave me a bit of a kind of, security debrief in terms of the things that I should do, I shouldn't do. Harry Evans patted Peter on the shoulder and said, "Beware of Mossad. They're the best intelligence agency in the world." And Peter looked at him and was like, "Okay, how do you want me to do that?" Like, what? Yeah, okay, great. Be careful. Fine. Anyway, so the list was really long, as I was saying. There was Mossad, the Egyptians themselves, the Saudi secret services, Palestinian terrorists, all sorts of people. But they sort of, eventually, what Peter thought was that the killing was such an elaborate operation that for any other, kind of foreign intelligence agency to do it would have been incredibly difficult, because the guy was picked up at the airport, right? I mean, it's even in 1977, because of this peace conference, there was a lot of security in place. And so Peter decided that the most likely suspects were the Egyptians themselves. But what was escaping was the motive. I mean, he had amassed enough information about Holden to suspect that Holden had been working, or at least moonlighting, as an intelligence agent. And it wasn't because of journalism that he was actually killed, but probably because he'd been doing other things. Now, what these other things were and who he was working for, that was the kind of, those were the big questions that Peter just simply couldn't answer them. The report, so there was this great moment when Peter invited me to his house and he actually handed me these, 110 pages of typewritten research material. And there were so many names in there, all the people that Holden had met during the last trip. There was the passenger's manifest for the flight that he'd taken from Amman to Cairo, with all the names of the people on board. I mean, it was just incredible material that I used that to start the new investigation, to check every single name, to see if people were alive, if they, written memoirs, if they donated their papers to a library or anything like that. And, slowly I managed to confirm a lot of suspicions that Peter had about some of the people that that Holden had met during the last trip. And a lot of them turned out to be somehow linked to the CIA.
Since you mentioned the Egyptians were a suspect, as I recall, there was this incredibly chilling encounter that happened before Peter's death. Can you talk about that a little, or before David's death? Excuse me. I think it was another journalist named David Holden or something like that, who traveled to Cairo.
David Holton. Yes, Holton, so that was one of the big reveal. I talked to this guy called David Holton. He's a Canadian journalist, he's kind of an esteemed foreign correspondent. And he told me that 3 years before David Holden was assassinated in 1974, he landed in Cairo late at night. And as he was coming out of the airport, he was approached as he was coming out of security, actually, after having his passport stamped, 2 Egyptian officials approached him, introduced themselves, and said that they were going to give him a lift, take him to his destination. Holton was a bit bemused because he hadn't informed anyone of his visit, but, it was late at night, he was tired, he could have used the lift. And so he got into this battered car with these 2 officials. Driver was already there. It's at the front. And as the car sped up, these 2 people started asking him questions and mentioning names he didn't know and, details of stuff that he had no knowledge of. So he turned around and asked, I'm sorry, but how did you know that I was coming? And one of the guys said, well, you're David Holden of the Sunday Times, aren't you? Oh, no, sorry, I'm David Holton of CBC. And the 2 Egyptians looked at each other in disbelief, and then, after a few minutes decided, oh, well, we're just going to drive you to your destination. Left him at his hotel, And Holton didn't think about the incident until 3 years later. He heard that, David Holden had been picked up at the airport by someone, driven around in a battered car, then shot and dumped on the side of a road.
My gosh.
So that was the moment when we discovered that we think that was the sort of the first time that the Egyptian Secret Service was trying to kill Holton, and it was back in 1974. And so that was the moment where we kind of switched. With the sort of the way we were looking at this changed. We were looking at this from the perspective of the 1977 shift and the peace conference and all the rest of that. But if you look at it from 1974, now things change. That we eventually figured out that the motive, the reason why he was killed, had to do with something else entirely. It wasn't because of Sadat's visit to Israel.
My gosh, incredible. Just thinking that the plan was at least 3 years in the making. Then if, Halton was totally correct and your assessments are correct, it's amazing that he had that target on his back all that time. And he just unknowingly walked right into that trap that day in Cairo.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Holton was kind of, it also came home rather graphically, because when David Holden was assassinated in 1977, a Canadian radio station mistaken Holden for Holton and said David Holden, foreign correspondent of the CBC, was assassinated in Cairo. So he could call his wife and said, "Darling, the news of my death has been greatly exaggerated." He could use the Mark Twain line. But yeah, I mean, it was just, these kind of details are just stranger than fiction to me. If I was reading this in a novel, I was like, I'd just dismiss it as
a bit far-fetched.
Kind of tricks. A bit far-fetched, exactly.
My gosh. Yeah, I can imagine David Holton must have had some sleepless nights after 1978 in that case, because he escaped by the thinnest of margins, it sounds like.
Yeah, he says it was even if he'd been reporting about wars for many, many years, he said that was the most frightening moment of his life. Mm-hmm. And he had no idea what was happening. He could have taken a bullet.
Yeah, because he didn't have his defenses up, I guess you could say. Was not sure what to expect. Man, just so chilling, honestly.
Yeah.
So, Emanuele, did you ultimately reach any major conclusions, any findings after this, 45-year break in between his death and the original investigation and your own investigation?
Well, the biggest reveal, and Peter was right. He was, his hunch was correct. He thought that this guy, Leo Silberman, was the most important relationship in Holden's life, and indeed he was. And what I found was that Silberman had been a communist, actually a kind of fanatic, really. I found his letters that, in the 1930s, he'd been working for the Comintern, which is the International Communist Party from the Soviet Union, and he'd been recruiting young men to the Soviet cause, to the communist cause, using a sort of mix of sex and politics. And Holden was one of them. We're pretty sure about that. And so the Holden's life had to be reread and under that kind of perspective now, that of someone who'd been possibly recruited by the KGB through this lover as early as 1950, before he even became a journalist. So that was the kind of big reveal in the new investigation. But there's something else that I've kept from, I've written this very long story for the Sunday Times Magazine, and it's about the sort of the CIA angle. Very going to interest your listeners a bit more.
Oh, yeah. Is that soon to come, or is that in the book as well?
It's in the book. There's a guy, is basically our main suspect. I can say that. And he was the CIA station chief in Cairo in 1977. And interestingly enough, he set up this important CIA station in Cairo in 1974, which is the year of the near miss with David Holton. And what happened in 1974? Essentially, it was the conclusion of a shift that had been a few years in the making, in which So that the president of Egypt had changed sides, had switched sides from the Soviet Union's sphere of influence to the Americans, and he'd become a partner of the Americans, especially of the USA, especially when it came to covert operations and clandestine operations in the Middle East and Africa. Egypt became an important ally of the States. And so, again, that allowed us to answer the main question, which was why was Holton killed? And we think it's because he was exposed as being a KGB agent, and the ground had shifted in Egypt at that point, and that's why he was killed. That's why he had to die.
Incredible stuff. Wow. Well, fantastic job, Emanuele, bringing all of this to light. I mean, I know that there are always going to be more questions, with a case like this, and probably there will never be answers to many of those questions, especially after this much time. But just some incredible work digging up this 45-year-old story there and shedding so much new light on it. And David is still kind of a enduring mystery to me and to you as well, it sounds like. But
thank you. Yes,
things are a little more clear now, certainly. And he was at the nexus of all these different organizations and all these different places and times, during very volatile periods. So just astonishing stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow. So I know that the book has been published out now, and for the listeners out there who want to read a lot more about this story, of course, we could never go over all of the details of the story, and there are quite a few more twists and turns that we haven't gotten into as well. The book is Murder in Cairo, Solving a Cold War Spy Mystery by Emanuele Midolo and Peter Gillman. It's available now. I love this book. I read through it in just a few days. Emanuele, I know that it took you a lot longer than a few days to write it, of course, you and Peter, but I read
that's
through
the greatest compliment. Thank you.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it a lot, and I think everybody's going to enjoy it as well. So now that the book is out, are you working on another book, or do you have another project in the works at the moment?
Well, this has been this has been in the back of my mind for so long. Obviously, not as long as Peter. I mean, he could finally retire now, and so is his garage because his wife has been pestering him over the last 5 years. But I've been doing this in my spare time, other than my day job at the Times and Sunday Times, and I kind of miss it now. So this is a scoop. I've been doing a bit of research over the last couple of months, doing something about the mafia, because I'm originally Italian. I'm from Sicily, and it's something that I always been trying to avoid, kind of being sort of entangled in the kind of mafia thing, but it's obviously a fascinating subject, and there might be, again, an American angle. So it's still early days, but it's about another unsolved murder mystery. Becoming a bit of an expert in that.
Yeah, you're right back into the lion's den for you as well, it sounds like. The time in Egypt didn't scare you off from this kind of reporting?
No, I mean, it's the best kind of feeling, like doing this kind of reporting and doing something original and new that, other people have not looked into as much. It's the best feeling, really.
I believe it. Well, fantastic work. I mean, this is a great achievement on your part and on Peter's part. I really enjoyed the work, and hopefully a lot more people will read the book and after they've learned the story from you here. So thank you so much for your time. Do you have social media pages or website or anything that you'd like to share if people want to follow along, especially with your next book in development?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter, X, whatever we want to call it. There is Manu Midolo, so that's MANUMIDOLO, and Blue Sky as well. And yeah, I mean, do reach out. My DMs are open, as you say.
Fantastic. Yeah, we'll link those up in the show notes for the listeners if you want to follow along with Manuel after this. Thank you so much. I really appreciate your time, and I look forward to what you're working on again after this.
Thank you, Justin.
Take care. If you're interested in more of Spycraft 101, look for my page on Instagram at Spycraft 101. You can also find more great articles on my website, spycraft101.com. Thank you all for listening, and I hope you'll stick around because there's lots more to come.
Disclaimer. This podcast is for entertainment purposes only. The stories and statements expressed herein are experiences and opinions. They may not reflect the views of the host or the production studio. It's okay if you disagree with our content. No piece of media is right for everyone. If you love Spycraft 101, please check us out online, on Instagram, on YouTube, and especially on Patreon. Thank you for listening.